So I can tell you're planning ahead. From the very beginning, you plan those whites were going to be there.
I'm planning ahead to create that reflective shadows and then continue to build up certain elements of it.
Do you want to introduce yourself to the camera and what we're going to be doing?
Yeah. What, up here?
No, right there.
I didn't even see that camera.
Go everywhere.
Hey everybody, I'm Alex Sinclair. I am a colorist for DC, Marvel, Image, and today we're going to do a quick color demo using markers. I use Copic. Markers kind of pose a little bit of a challenge, and it's a lot of fun. This is my beat up case, but it's a case that I carry to all the conventions with me, and it's because it has my full set of markers. I like these markers so much, and that has dual tips. You can also buy refills for them, and then you can just pour the inks into the marker and refill them, and so that you really only have to buy one marker. They also sell the nibs, so if your nibs kind of dry out or crack out, buy a new one, you slide it in there, and so that your marker purchase is a little more economical than having to buy a marker every time your marker dies. All right, so we're gonna slide this sucker out of the way. Our old friend Ryan Benjamin did a commission for a fan, and so I get these a lot of conventions. Folks will bring me a pre-done commission in black and white and commission me to do the colors of it. I really just approach it like I would a regular piece. Particular one, we got Venom versus Miles Morales Spiderman. And much like I do when I work digitally, I set a base color and go from there. The beauty of these markers, they also sell these wide markers as they call them, and they're great because they help cover these large spaces of white that would take forever to fill with a regular marker. So just kind of reading what Ryan has drawn and anticipating what I'm going to be doing with the piece as I work my way through it.
What sort of paper is it?
It looks like it's a Bristol. It's great in that it can absorb the ink and real well. It doesn't have like a very thick or treated coating, and so it doesn't repel the ink. And I'm going very light touch. Some of the markers that Ryan used here are water-based. It's not alcohol, but the chemical base that these markers use will sometimes pull up the marker, and so you kind of have to be very careful so that I'm not pulling up too much of Ryan's work. This one's a little tough, and there's webbing that's supposed to be in color too, so I'm gonna kind of finesse my way around some of these edgings. This set comes with 4 sets of grays, so you have a warm gray, a neutral gray, a toner gray, and a cool gray. So I'm gonna come in with a cool gray here and deepen up these blues.
What are the differences when you're working traditionally versus digitally?
You kind of have to be a little bit more plan ahead of what you want to do, in that you don't have undos like you do digitally. And so you also have to work specifically light to dark, much like you would with a painting, for obvious reasons, in that you can't go back and paint over. To highlight, I would have to come back with some kind of opaque paint, and doing so might obliterate some of the inks too, and so that I'm kind of walking that fine line between the two. And again, reading what Ryan's been doing with the inks to establish where the highlights are, the shadows are coming from, where the shadows taper and where they open up to highlighting. Certain areas I'm leaving white, and that's because I'm reading what Ryan's doing. There's reflective lighting that I want to bring into this to give it a little bit more dimension. Come back with that lighter blue I used before and blend that in so that it looks a little more subtle transitions of color. The other thing you kind of have to do when you work on this is tend to go by character or by area. When I work digitally, I'm kind of working on the whole piece at once to kind of get that cohesive feel and overall color. But for these, I tend to kind of like to focus a little bit more on the characters themselves first, and then do the backgrounds. Kind of helps me pop them a little bit. Yeah, and obviously you can spend hours and hours on stuff like this if you wanted to and get super detailed, but again, at the end of the day, it tends to be works better if you simplify, if you don't over render, especially when you're working on something like this that Ryan put a ton of detail in the inks too, and so I don't really have to bring a lot of that into play on my own. And I will say that working digitally kind of makes you a little bit more fearless, obviously, because you have multiple undos, you have masks. Throwing lines and getting bold with your brush strokes comes easy when it's digital, and I found that when I came back to traditional drawing that I was more confident with the way I was throwing lines and drawing and all that kind of stuff. So I kind of built that confidence with the safety net of the undo button, but I was able to kind of carry it through to my practical work like this.
If you were to make a mistake traditionally, how would you fix it?
kind of have to paint through it a little bit. Try to come back and use some paint if you have paint. Sometimes you just kind of work it into what you're doing.
Do you have any tips for anyone wanting to learn marker coloring?
Treat it like watercolor. They're very translucent, and so that you obviously want to work light to dark. And much like painting, you layer, and so that if you just use one flat color on it, it works if you're going for a very design-driven look. But for something like this, for comics, where the artwork is hyper realistic, you want to come back and make sure that you're rendering to match what the artist has done before you. It's also funny how when you work on paper, you flip it and you turn it. When you're digital, you actually really don't do much of that.
Yeah, right.
Because you can throw the line, if you don't like it, you undo it and you throw it again until you get it perfect. You swivel the paper to make sure that line that you're throwing comes out right the first time.
Yeah.
Come back and blend these in so that you get nice subtle transitions.
Are there any old masters or fine artists that you look at for color?
Yeah, for color, I always looked at the Impressionists. Van Gogh is my favorite Impressionist. For technique and anatomy and dramatic posing, the High Renaissance. So like the Michelangelos, the Leonardos are always great to look at. And then for comics themselves, colorists that really influenced my work, like Joe Chito. Joe's an amazing artist, so he definitely influenced me a lot. Lynn Varley is one of my heroes from her work on Dark Knight Returns and also Elektra Lives Again. Mark Chiarello is also an incredible draftsman, illustrator, colorist, and so his work always kind of has spoken to me, and definitely someone that I look to for inspiration. Definitely study the artists that you like. A lot of our styles are born out of borrowing from artists we admire, and say like J. Scott Campbell has a very distinct style, but it's kind of this combination of 4 or 5 artists that he's always kind of looked up to, and it really influenced his work early on. Obviously study the colorists that you really like and see how they treat light, how they treat shadow, how they treat reflective light, how they do textures. All those things that you want to get good at that you need to use as tools for coloring comics. I'm not saying copy what they do, but see if you can kind of do an interpretation of their style. Different approaches to coloring that maybe you wouldn't have thought of on your own.
Right.
Kind of stumble upon little things that you like, so you kind of
Steal
steal and borrow from different artists, and through that you'll find your style. You might surprise yourself. Sometimes you arrive at a style that you didn't think you were going to be using or happy with.
Like, how are you deciding to do certain colors?
Well, digitally I usually have preset colors for every character, and because I'm layering here, I'm using grays to shade with, and then I'm washing it with a color, and so that Venom is black, but it's kind of a blue black, and so what I'm going to start with is the grades to drop in the shading, and then I'm going to wash it over with a blue to get that Venom kind of blue black in the end. And so kind of working here and making sure that the values that I'm ending up with don't compete too much with Spider-Man, because we got to make sure that both these characters pop. And it's always fun to work on art like this. Ryan's stuff is got so much energy to it, and so that I'm trying to kind of replicate that with the colors and the brush strokes too, so that I'm play a little bit with the transition here on his back between his blue black and the smoke that he's crashing through.
You're kind of following the forms with the color, right?
Yeah. And you can see my strokes are kind of, they mimic what that muscle would look like, and that sometimes these markers leave strokes behind, and it's kind of cool because it leaves shapes, and so that I'm not just going like this.
Yeah.
I'm actually kind of mimicking and contouring the rendering that Ryan has there.
Yeah.
And by layering the marker, you end up getting that effect. With Venom, I'm leaving some areas like spotting whites in there for highlights, and so that his symbiote is kind of liquidy, and so I want him to make sure that he looks very reflective, very shiny where the light hits. So that's why you're seeing me kind of leave certain areas white, whereas with Spider-Man, I'm only leaving that for a very specific reason with this kind of back shadowing that I'm going to be doing, the reflective shadows.
Would you color the background with the marker as well? Or?
Yeah. And for something like this, I'll use the wider markers to create some of the motion. I also have an airbrush that they sell that has a little kind of adapter for these markers, and then you just kind of use the markers as airbrush too.
Wouldn't it be great if you could learn from a living legend in the comic book industry? David Finch has teamed up with Proko in this exclusive comic course. David will create a full comic page from start to finish and guide you on how you can do it too. Don't let your inner villain, Inaction, and his evil sidekick, Do Nothing, stop you from taking action. If you're interested in learning more, go to proko.com/comic page.
If somebody wanted to get like a, $30 or $40 marker color set, where do you think they should start? Which colors?
That's a great question. It depends. If you're going to be doing, landscapes, then earth tones and greens is definitely a way to go. If you're doing superhero work, get the primaries and grays. I would definitely recommend get a set of grays, whether it's a neutral gray or toner gray or a cool gray.
Yeah.
It's a good way to kind of be more economical about it, in that you do all of your rendering kind of like I'm doing with the grays, and then come back and use the blues or the reds or whatever color that you're using to render, so that instead of using 2 reds for Spider-Man, you could have used the grays and then used the 1 red to kind of wash over everything.
Right.
To get the same effect that I did. It's a little bit more faster for me in the way that I work with color, as opposed to from gray to color.
Right.
Fighting that inker instinct.
Yeah.
You kind of see me kind of pulling back and squinting, and I'm trying to see if anything's popping that shouldn't be popping, or if something's not popping that should be popping. Find little things like that shouldn't be there, and so that the head pops a little better. See how this blue kind of behaves with. It's a really, really light blue.
Do you squint a lot when you're painting or coloring in general?
Yeah, a lot, all the time. In fact, my mom always used to yell at me.
Squinting all the time?
Do you need glasses? Why are you squinting? It's like, it's kind of merging, mimicking. Some people like to pull it away. Some people like to put it up to the light and look at it backwards. Especially pencilers and inkers will do this a lot, just to make sure that the right things, you're so used to seeing it this way, by flipping it, seeing it negative, it's certain things pop out more.
Yeah.
I'm actually kind of liking just the gray.
Yeah.
Somehow. Lean into it and just keep it dark gray like that. Just gonna go a little bit deeper on some of these shadows. The real trick is knowing when to stop or when to move on to the next thing.
Do you have any tips on that?
Ryan here, what he's doing a lot of really heavy rendering and leaving giant gaps, but on a character that's black, and so what I'm kind of doing is I'm kind of following what he started and just kind of finishing it off, and then really just making the highlight something like this as opposed to something like that, and so that he's leaving room for the color to come in and add to that kind of dimensionality or mass of the character. So knowing when to stop is more of a preference, because you can noodle something to death and it still looks the same as it did half an hour ago. And I think I've reached that point a little bit. I'm gonna come in and do just one last really light to render, soften these transitions here into the whites.
Are there any coloring exercises somebody could do in their sketchbook really easily, or anything?
I would recommend doing value exercises, and so that work with one color or just grays and render something so that you can give it mass, be able to establish relationships between 2 objects with just one color is something that's very hard. I think value is probably the one lesson that is the hardest for artists to really grasp. When you're working in black and white, it's easier to work with value. When you step into color, it's a lot harder to manage the values. A color that you don't necessarily think is a deep value, like red, actually carries a really strong value to it, and so you have to make sure that you work it accordingly so it doesn't overpower too much of the art. This is where the big wide markers pay off. I'm kind of mimicking the movements that Ryan kind of put down in ink. As I'm coloring it, I'm pulling up a little bit of the ink in some parts of this, so that it kind of ends up helping the art a little bit too, accentuating certain areas that Ryan had on there. Those happy mistakes that Bob Ross loved so much. So you'll kind of see I'm using very desaturated colors, like background elements now, so that it doesn't overpower the characters themselves, especially in a character that's predominantly just grays. You don't want to bring, pink smoke, because all of a sudden the pink smoke takes over. Well, I do teach an art course, a comic book art course with Comic Pro Bootcamp. We're about to post the next set of classes that we're going to be teaching. It's virtual, but it's not a recorded lesson that you just watch and do. We're actually live teaching and instructing at the time so that students can stop, ask questions, interject, and then at the end of the lesson, we give a homework assignment, and then when we come back, everybody turns in their assignment and we critique it for them. That ability to be with another artist and kind of bounce ideas off, show your work to another artist and have them critique it for you and let you know what's working, what isn't working on a piece so that you can make it the best possible piece that you can create. Getting close to the end here, I'm doing a little bit of debris work, and we'll come back and do a little bit of the reflective shading that I was doing on Spiderman. I want him to pop out a little bit. One thing you can also add to your markers is colored pencils. So sometimes I'll bring my colored pencils as well, and it kind of helps you come in here, and a little bit of the graphite lets you add texture to, say, the rocks to help them pop from the characters, much like you would do digitally where you're using different texture brushes to create all that.
At any point, would you add anything else into the background, or?
Yeah, I'm probably going to come in with a little bit of a brighter yellow, especially in this area, to accentuate Spider-Man. And once I do the reflective shading on him, it'll kind of be clearer what I'm talking about. Right now I'm just kind of trying not to put too much detail into the debris since it's just really kind of window dressing stuff.
If this were digital, what would you do differently?
I don't know, I wouldn't use white as much of a accentuating factor, and especially in commissions like this, you use white as an element, as negative space. You know, when you get towards the end, you're just kind of, it's funny, you end up like almost speeding up because you can kind of feel it, and some of the little things that you didn't notice before start to really pop out, and so or ideas come, like taking the web past into the white there.
So I can tell you're planning ahead. From the very beginning, you plan those whites were going to be there?
Yeah, so reading the inks in that, you're seeing where Ryan's highlighting, shading, and then there's a secondary kind of highlight, and that's with the reflective shadow, so that if, you know, my hand's sitting here, there's a light coming here, so the highlight's here, there's a radial shadow that at some point stops because that same light is hitting the paper underneath it and bouncing and coming back, and so lighting the bottom of my hand. And so a lot of things that you know you can do an experiment with is do this, say with your iPad, and then put open up a page that's all red on your iPad with a light bulb here, and you'll see that the top of your hand is natural colors, white, shadows, but then this kind of underlighting or reflective lighting is red on your hand, or green or blue, depending what you're doing with your screen. And so I'm planning ahead to create that reflective shadow, since they're crashing through a window, maybe an explosion and something like that, and as I continue to build up certain elements of it, I want to make sure that the colors that I'm using in the background here, you saw me putting him on here and then putting him on him as well, and so that he's being lit by the environment. So it's a lot of planning, but also kind of changing on the fly too. As the piece kind of progressed, I find myself adding stuff or taking away stuff, and something that I thought I was going to do, I ended up not even doing. Just little things like that. Another thing you can do is take like a jelly roll pen and paint a little bit of white and then smudge out so that the smoke looks a little bit more real, those kind of things. And then once you're done, the last thing you need is there you have it. I'm most active in Twitter and Instagram. My handles both there are SincColor, SINCCOLOR, so 2 C's in the middle. I post my appearances there when we launch our classes for Comic Pro Bootcamp. If you want more information on that, feel free to follow us or go to comicprobootcamp.com. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much.
Yeah, anytime.